This video is dedicated to Aijaz Ahmad, the phenomenal Marxist thinker and literary theorist who passed away last month. May his soul rest in peace. In the previous part of this lecture series, we observed that Ahmad criticizes the tendency to theorize about a category called Indian literature without considering the complexity of the various components, the various linguistic clusters, the various literary forms and genres and material aspects that comprise this so-called category called Indian literature. He criticizes the tendency of treating third world literature and Indian literature as a fixed category on which theoretical generalizations were possible. He considered this a hasty way of approaching such a diverse collection of literary works and histories such as Indian literature. He advocated for a more interrelated and a more comparative study of languages in order to consider them a part of a larger body of work that may be called Indian literature. In this lecture, we discuss the next section of the essay in which Ahmad continues to enlist the problems one will have to consider while attempting to theorize about a category called Indian literature. What are the problems? Let's see. The text is on your screen. I advise you to pause and read and play the lecture after you have read it. So Ahmad begins by saying that there's a tendency among scholars to consider works written by people belonging to a particular geographical location as part of a larger national literature. Works written by Indians, whether inside or outside India, for example, are usually considered the part of a larger national literature called Indian literature. He considers this tendency as a hasty way, a lazy way of generalizing different languages and literatures, having a complex and uncertain history with a number of material factors impacting their development into a larger, fixed, homogeneous group called Indian literature. At this point, you must also remember that in the introduction to this chapter, in the previous lecture that I posted, Ahmad says that a national literature is not the sum of its regional constituent parts. He says that all the literary works written in Punjabi, Bengali, Uriya, Marathi, Assamese, and probably Marwari and Maithili and other marginal languages, you cannot be considering them Indian literature unless and until their development and their history and their impact on the culture is interrelated or can be compared to each other in an organic manner. A national literature, in other words, is not the sum of its constituent parts. And how are we going to know whether the works are interrelated to each other, whether the works have an interrelated history, whether they develop out of similar traditions or cultures, whether they have some factors in common so that they can be studied in relation to each other or in comparison to each other? How can we do all of that? Only when coherent and unified knowledge about such interconnections is available somewhere. Only when some institution, some university, some group, or a collection of scholars unite to make such knowledges available for other scholars, for teachers, for students to study it further. It will only be available when there is some portal, some website, some archive, some department, or some institutional site where such knowledge may be organized systematically and made available for students, teachers, scholars, and researchers who want to actually investigate how various literatures, despite their different languages, are so interconnected that they may be studied as a thing called Indian literature. However, Ahmad says that there are hardly any institution that has taken up this unification work, this organization work, this systematically organizing knowledges about various languages and literatures of India. And therefore, the scholars who have taken upon themselves to create such interrelations and comparisons, to study such interrelations and comparisons, are scattered and dispersed and not really neatly collectively organized. And so there's a huge gap in our knowledge about the various literary productions that may be studied as interrelated entities of an Indian literature. All right, let's try to understand this with an example. I am taking, the example of a mainstream language to make the case. But imagine that when things are so difficult for a mainstream language, what will be the case of a more marginal language? All right. So carrying on with the example, what is the relationship between the literary works written in Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, for example? How the literary works of these languages collectively show the historical developments in the south of India, how the adoption and abandonment of different genres within these languages cross state boundaries and yet are connected. All right, how the picking up and dropping of genres reflect the social, cultural, political, and economic realities of the time. All these questions could only be answered when there's some site where the coherent and unified knowledge about all of this is available. But Ahmad says that that has not happened in a systematic way in the case of India, and hence there are problems in considering a unified and coherent category called Indian literature. This is the first problem that he mentions in this section. Now I'm going to take up the next paragraph and the text is displayed on screen. Please pause, take a look and come back for the explanation. This is the second problem that Ahmad mentions in investigating a category called Indian literature. And the problem is that there are so many languages in India for which there's no credible history available, right? So this may or may not be true of the major languages like Hindi, Sanskrit, and Bengali and Tamil, but for many languages that are widely spoken but are not considered mainstream, the history is simply not available, partly because of their oral nature. So many narratives were performative and oral that their history hasn't percolated to the present time. It hasn't reached us. Histories for some literary works are only available in their original language. Consider Maithili, which has more than 12 million speakers in India. Consider Santhali, which has more than 6 million speakers in India. And yet, if I want to go on and study the interrelationships and comparisons between Maithili and Santhali, because they're spoken in very close areas and same areas, I will not be able to do that without the mediation of English, because the history of Maithili and Santhali will not be accessible to a person who does not understand Maithili or Santhali. I will only be able to understand the literary history of Santhali if someone has translated it into English. The tradition of mutual translations within various languages of India is so weakly developed that the history of the political, social, and cultural aspects of the interrelationships and comparisons between Maithili and Santhali may be inaccessible to a person who does not know both the languages. So, due to this gap, what we are left with is an assumption that there's actually a unified literature called Indian literature, whereas the reality is that we don't really have a unified entity called Indian literature. What we have is discrete archives. I'm using Ahmad's words here. We have discrete archives of different languages with no effort to find the interrelation between them, with no network of mutual translation, with no effort to study them as realities that impact each other, with no consideration to the common factors strong enough to relate them in a way that justifies their grouping together as part of a larger body of literature called Indian literature. So you may say, so what? There's an entity called European literature, which consists of literatures from France and Italy and Spain and Germany. They're not mutually translated, but we still have a thing called European literature. Ahmad says that there's a problem in using this analogy. There's an ocean of difference between the way Indian languages have developed and the way European languages like German and Spanish and French and Italian have developed and relate to each other. These languages have been relatively independent as compared to Indian languages. Indian languages, for example, Hindi, Urdu, Gujarati, Marwari, Tamil and Sanskrit, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada and Malayalam. These languages have closely impacted each other's growth. They have very similar historical trajectories. They have many a times grown from each other, and studying them in relation to each other will reveal a lot about the cultural, religious, social, political, and economical realities of the time about India. So, just on the basis of civilizational unity, you cannot imagine an Indian literature the way people have a tendency to consider European literature, because European languages are relatively more independent than Indian languages, which are closely connected. In the next two paragraphs, Ahmad gives you examples of the kind of gaps and confusions exist regarding the development of various language literatures in India. All right, our modern languages have emerged out of complex and prolonged processes of mutual influences and differentiations. Ahmed will make this point again and again in this essay that our languages are very interconnected. There have been complex and very long processes of mutual influences. For example, Hindi has influenced Urdu, and Urdu has influenced Hindi. There's mutual influence and also differentiations. We know that Hindi and Urdu are different language. How did they come to identify themselves as different languages? What are the mutual influences? This remains to be examined. But that sort of inquiry is simply not possible because we have huge gaps in our knowledge about the development of languages. Ahmed gives you an example of Sanskrit in the north and Tamil in the south, and he says that we know that these languages developed in the 1st century BC. But not all languages developed during the 1st century BC. The process of the development of various languages of India is regionally very uneven, first of all. And secondly, the histories of the development of these languages has been destroyed by the passage of time and by unreliable modes of transmission. Of course, 1st century BC was a long, long time ago, so that the history that we have is not the complete history, first of all. And secondly, due to the performative nature of Indian languages, we don't have much information about it because most of it was oral. Then Ahmed goes on to give example of Kannada to show you how the development of languages in India was regionally uneven. There's a huge time gap. For example, you see that Sanskrit and Tamil developed in the 1st century BC, but Kannada developed in the 5th century AD. Between 1st century BC and 5th century AD, how did languages impact each other? How did they grow in relation to each other? What were the other marginal languages that grew and perhaps died during that period? Hardly any information is available about that. Another type of gap that Ahmed gives example of is the way in which the mainstream languages of the north have made an impact on the languages of the south. Ahmed gives the example of how Sanskrit impacted Malayalam. Malayalam has borrowed many words from Sanskrit, but how that happened, what was the impact of that borrowing, and what were the cultural factors due to which this happened, and what cultural factors were created because of this. This has not been studied in detail. Similarly, he says that much remained to be explored about the growth and development and the travel of Sangam literature from south to north, which happened alongside the growth of Sanskrit, but still remains much less studied than Sanskrit literature, although they belong roughly to the same period. Also, Ahmed points out that there remains a serious lack of scholarship in exploring how Sangam literature of the South, the Sangam movement of the South, traveled from the South towards the North in a gradual, slow process that lasted for centuries, and how the Sangam movement of the South emerged in the North as a Bhakti movement. Whenever this is mentioned, whenever Bhakti literature in the North is mentioned in relation to the Sangam literature in the South, it is mentioned as if there was a Sangam literature in the South, but after a gap of a couple of centuries, Bhakti literature emerged in the North like an epochal shift rather than a slow, gradual process being impacted by so many cultures along the way going from the South to the North. So another kind of lack, another kind of flaw, you may say, in recording of history where movements, the nature of movements has been misinterpreted and not mentioned correctly. Then Ahmed comes to the way the Upabhranshas, the dialects of India, got consolidated into modern Indian languages. He says that there's not enough scholarship on this issue, how the various dialects, how the various upabhranshas of India got a distinct identity slowly, gradually, and how they emerged as modern Indian languages. Ahmed says that we know this in the outline, and we know that this happened, that the Upabhranshas developed into languages, and we know that it is an uneven process. It happened in a way that some languages consolidated first and some languages consolidated later. Some languages are still getting consolidated. For example, Bengali consolidated quite early. Hindi and Urdu are still impacting each other. And then there's a difference in language use. For example, Ahmed mentions that millions of people in Uttar Pradesh have shifted from Hindustani to Hindi in the 1961 census, as recent as the 1960s. Right? And in Bihar, people are shifting from Hindi to Maithili. So, language use is still changing. So, how can you fix an Indian literature when the various languages and various language literatures that make up Indian literature are so fluid, ever changing, and not fixed at all? And therefore, the above problems, gaps, confusions, inadequacies, Ahmed believes, is enough to warn anyone who tries to theorize about a category called Indian literature, anyone who's naive enough to consider Indian literature as a fixed, well defined, neatly organized category. Then Ahmed stresses the point that in the context of India and its languages and literatures, even plain history writing, which is a mere recording of facts in a chronological manner, even plain historiography is in a very basic stage, very initial stage. Now, you see that here Ahmed draws a binary between what can be called descriptive kind of knowledge and analytical kind of knowledge. Plain history writing is descriptive. You describe the facts and you describe the events in a chronological order. Whereas writing about the development of literature, the various factors that impacted the literary productions, the various factors that impacted the genres, forms, movements, and styles that developed in literature are the result of many social, cultural, political, economic factors, and they impacted these factors in return. This knowledge, on the other hand, as opposed to the plain history writing, is of an analytical kind, not of the plain descriptive kind. Ahmed says that at present, even the descriptive kind of history is in its basic undeveloped stage. And you saw in the above examples that so many things are not known to us, so many things that we know are not correct, so many things have gaps, so many things are so misinterpreted historically. So, how can we expect to theorize an Indian literature analytically when even descriptive knowledge has so many gaps? After this, Ahmed mentions a major problem in the recording of literary history in India. He says that India is a land of so many languages, and yet, when we talk about an Indian literature, it is usually considered to be a literature comprised of Hindi, Bengali, maybe Gujarati, Marathi, the major languages, perhaps Sanskrit and Tamil majorly. So, these are the languages that we perceive when we talk about an Indian literature. Ahmed points out that most authors writing in India before the 19th century and many even after 19th century were multilingual. Hardly any author wrote in only one language. Most of the authors wrote in more than three languages. And he gives Mohan Singh Divana's quotation in which he mentions the names of so many poets and so many writers, and he shows how each and every writer wrote in more than two languages. They wrote at least in three languages, some of them even wrote in four languages. Then he gives the example of Mughal kings and includes the name of Akbar, who also composed in more than one languages and who also composed in the Bhakti mold, as we now know. All right, and in Bengal, Vidyapati, Ahmed mentions, wrote in Hindi and Maithili and Bengali, and he says that this list could be infinite as to how these authors wrote in so many languages. So he says that multilinguality, authors writing in languages more than two, three, four, multilinguality is perhaps the only feature that unites Indian literature. almost all the authors in India before 19th century and some even after 19th century wrote in more than three languages, and this multilinguality is perhaps the only characteristic that the works of Indian literature and the authors they share. So he says that the people who say that Indian literature is Sanskrit literature or Indian literature is Bengali literature are of the scholastic kind who wants to create a canon of a high literature written in only the mainstream languages like Sanskrit and Tamil. Ahmad says that the aspiration of unilinguality, the aspiration to portray the elite Brahminical languages as the languages of Indian literature, to portray literature in Sanskrit and Tamil and Bengali as synonymous to Indian literature. This aspiration was the consequence of a canonical scholasticism. Such canonical scholasticism attempted to highlight the Brahminical languages as the languages of India, and this was also an attempt to marginalize the mass literary cultures of a diverse country like India. Ahmad believes that the polyglot fluidity, the use of so many languages by so many authors, the multilinguality was one of the major essential characteristics of the literature written in India. Then there's another kind of problem. He says that even if we mention that suppose Meera was writing in Rajasthani Vraj and Gujarati, he says that Vraj was so close to Hindui that you might also say that she was composing in Rajasthani Vraj, Gujarati, and Hindui. So the nature of languages, because since they emerged out of each other and since they were really closely connected to each other, it wasn't really wise to differentiate between the languages in the way they were differentiated. Then he points out the problems with the quotations that was mentioned above. He says that it was the colonial agenda to provide a three-language formula in which there was the mother tongue, one provincial language, and the common Hindustani language. He says that this formula was provided by the colonial demographers and the indigenous linguistic fundamentalists. He says that the nature of language use in India was not like this. Languages interacted with each other, got impacted from each other, impacted each other in a wholly different way than was imposed by the linguistic fundamentalists and the colonial demographers. In India, overlapping multilingualities has been the nature rather than proper exclusivity as shown in the above example. Languages were not exclusive, language use was not exclusive. There was a kind of overlapping multilinguality. And this is where more research, more comparative work needs to be done. Ahmad once again mentions that the practice of translating works written in Indian languages, the practice of translating them to be circulated within the different linguistic communities of India is still very poorly developed despite the arrival of print capitalism in India, despite better classificatory practices today. We have access to much more information, and yet the mutual translations among the different languages in India has still not taken place. He gives the example of Urdu. He says that despite having access to the whole range of publishing in Urdu, we cannot get a sense of the literary developments in Kashmiri, Punjabi, Hindi, or Telugu. Now, these four languages he brings in to show that since these four languages existed with Urdu, these four languages were spoken in the areas where Urdu was also spoken. So one could expect that reading the publishings in the published material in Urdu, the literature in Urdu, will give you a sense of the development in Kashmiri, Punjabi, modern Hindi, and Telugu also. But he says that has not happened. All the Urdu academies, all the departments of Urdu in colleges and universities have failed to sponsor any real project of comparative scholarship. They have failed to carry out any projects of research and translation that will show the composite linguistic and cultural milieu in which these languages operate. That can give you a broader picture as to how Urdu was spoken, but other languages are also spoken, but how the cultural factors impact these languages, and how the growth of one language has impacted the other languages, how the genres that were being used in Punjabi or were being used in Telugu crossed the linguistic barriers and came to Urdu. He says that issues like this are still not studied. Ahmad says that Urdu is just one example out of many. This is the attitude of most of the languages in India. And he says that there are a few exceptions, like translations from other Indian languages are more common in Telugu and Bengali because of the individual efforts, and also Hindi because it is a state sponsored language and also there are individual efforts. So, more translation is happening in these languages rather than many other languages like Urdu, where reading all the publishings in Urdu will not give you a sense of how Urdu has been impacted by other languages and how it has impacted other languages and what does it mean in material terms. So let me take a moment and simplify this for you. What is it that Ahmed wants to tell you by giving this example of Urdu, Telugu, Hindi and Kashmiri? He is trying to point out that in order to approach Indian literature as a unified entity, the literature of the various languages in India, for example, Urdu, Telugu, Kashmiri, and Hindi, that developed in close relation to each other. Studying one language should give you the sense of what was happening in the literature of all the other languages that were close to that language. But he gives an example of Urdu and tells you that studying no matter how many literary works of Urdu will not give you a sense of what was happening in Telugu, Hindi, Kashmiri, the languages which were closely developing with Urdu in the same regions where Urdu was spoken. These languages were also spoken. In the same regions where people were writing in Urdu, they were also writing in Telugu, Kashmiri, Hindi. And even then, Urdu has not developed in a way that reading Urdu literature will give you a sense of all the other languages that were existing around it and obviously were impacting the culture in which Urdu literature was being written. So, in the absence of such work, it is hard to speak of an Indian literature as a unified entity. Now, Ahmed tries to explore the cause of such a gap. Why Urdu is not being studied in relation to Kashmiri, Punjabi, Telugu, and Hindi. He says that obviously, to take up translation projects like these, scholars need to have the knowledge of these languages. One scholar who also knows Urdu and also knows Hindi and also knows Punjabi and also knows Kashmiri. This kind of combination is rare. Then, it needs some sort of institutional backing for projects like this. In India, there is no institutional support to take up projects like this. Also, it needs a tremendous amount of commitment to take up a huge project like this, to study these four languages and the cultural milieu that they impacted. One needs exceptional commitment to the cause of translation and to the cause of research in translation to carry on a project like that. And he says that a rare combination where a person also knows the four languages and also is committed to the cause of translation and is committed to contributing to literary knowledge is rare. It's hard to find. And he says, it of course it happens. There are people like that, but they're extremely, extremely rare. So, what are we left with then if these people are rare? We have no other option but to get Indian languages translated into English. And we have no option but to get to know our Indian languages through the medium of English. And Ahmed says that, especially in the poetic genre, English is the most removed both in structure and in ambiance. English is the most far removed and the least suited to take up the job of translating works of Indian literary tradition into English, of course. So, usually the focus of a translator is to bridge the gap between the original and the translated piece. With English, it's just not possible. The gap between the original and the translated cannot be bridged without changing the original to an unrecognizable extent. He says that you can translate Meera into any other Indian language and that would make sense. But if you translate Meera into English, whatever you will get will be so funny that it will almost be unrecognizable and totally different from the original. So, this is one problem with using English as a language of translation of Indian languages, that it is very far removed in structure and in ambience. But also because not many people in India are proficient in English. So a few scholars and a few elite people belonging to the elite class may be proficient in English and may be able to understand what is being translated in English. But still, the Indian languages translated into English still remain inaccessible to a very large community in India which does not understand English. In the next paragraph, Ahmad mentions the two qualities that are actually characteristic of an Indian literature. And what are the two qualities? The heterogeneity and the fundamental unity of Indian literature. And how can we study these two characteristics, the heterogeneity and the fundamental unity of Indian literature? By doing a comparatism, by doing a comparative research as to various genres and forms of composition in Indian literature. Now, Ahmed gives you the example of a couple of genres that were prevalent in India. For example, the Pada, the Doha, then the Baramasa, and then the Mathnavi. He takes these four examples to show you how the Pada was a translinguistic entity. It was used in various languages by the Bhakti poets. And similarly, the Doha was also being used by many poets from many languages. And the Pada impacted the Doha, and the Doha then impacted the Baramasa. The Baramasa lived close to the Mathnavi form, which had Farsi impact. But what is the meaning of this? What belief systems were causing the birth of these genres? What belief systems were causing the dominance of one genre over another? What belief systems, what social conditions, what material factors were actually causing the replacement of one genre with another? This kind of research, this kind of comparative research is still required in this area, according to Ahmed. Similarly, in the modern period, he says, what kind of changes do social changes bring to the use of genres? For example, in India, in the introduction with the introduction of the companionate marriage in the 19th century, uh, what impact does this change reflect on the genre use, on the narrative structures, on the narrative styles, on the narrative themes in the literature of the period? He says this is important because the genre used says a lot about the society of the time. The prevalence of one genre or another, the prevalence of one genre and its replacement by another, the prevalence of one genre and its existing with many other genres at a time, says a lot about the society of the time. The genre use, in other words, says a lot about the belief systems of the time, about the society of the time, which shares those belief systems. For example, as soon as I say the word Kabir, it will mean so many things. You may think of the Doha form, the genre that Kabir used to compose in. You may think of religious poetry, which was also of a very secular nature. You may think of discipline. You may think of devotion. You may think of bhakti poetry. So many belief systems come to mind as soon as I say the word Kabir. So he says that in order to understand the heterogeneity of Indian literature and also the essential unity of it, one needs to consider the various genres and the implications of those genres and how those genres react to social changes. What were the factors that brought those genres into existence, and what were the factors that made those genres completely disappear or be replaced by other genres? And it is for this reason that Ahmed believes that simply enumerating the genres, simply enumerating the forms of composition that existed during a particular time within a particular society, simply classifying the aesthetic effects and properties of literary works, all of this will have no consequence, no significant consequence if the sociological factors are ignored, if the material factors are ignored, if the interrelationship between the literary forms, the literary genres, their predominance and their failures and their replacement is not studied in detail in relation to the literary texts that are produced in the time in that society. So, this was it about the part 1 of the chapter. In the 9 lecture series, this was the second lecture. The first lecture was the introductory part. Before wrapping up, allow me to give you a quick recap of the main points that we covered. So, in this section, Ahmad recounts the problems in considering a unified category called Indian literature. Number one, he says there are no institutions that have taken up the task of organizing the knowledge available on a unified portal where teachers and students and researchers can use the knowledge, use the coherent unified knowledge for further research. That kind of work has not happened in India. Number two, how can you assume an Indian literature when so many languages don't have a comprehensive and reliable history? We don't have their history. The history that is available is uneven and unreliable because of the oral and performative nature of Indian languages. Number three, a kind of canonical scholasticism portrayed as if most authors in India wrote in one language, but many authors in India wrote in many languages. They were multilingual. And since many writers were writing in many languages, the kind of classification that happens in the West is just not possible with the authors in India, right? Then next, Ahmad says that translation of one Indian language into another is only possible if a scholar knows those languages and is also so dedicated to take up the task of translation without many rewards. That kind of talent is rare in India. There is no institutional backup, there are no rewards. So that kind of translation work has not happened in India. So many scholars do not have the access to the various histories of various language literatures in India. And in the absence of such knowledge, the task of studying Indian literature as a unified category of various language literary clusters remains still incomplete. Next point, Ahmad says that English remains the language in which most of the Indian literary work is translated, and English is the least suitable language for it because it is the most removed in structure as well as ambience. But unfortunately, we don't have any other option. Most people who translate Indian languages, they translate it into English, and that's what we have available, and therefore the gap in approaching various language literatures in India and considering them a part of a unified whole. And lastly, Ahmad suggests that the genealogy of genres should be studied along with the sociology because they both are dependent on each other and they both reflect about each other a lot. And that's the way to create a comparative framework, a kind of research which is comparative in nature and thus reveals a lot about the integral nature of various language literatures in India. So this was it. If the video helped you, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your fellows, and consider subscribing to my channel. If the response to this video is great, I'd consider uploading the next parts sooner than I plan to. Thank you for